nirasya sarva sandeham akikritya sudarshanam prakashita rahasyam tam bhajami gurumishwaram. Itam Shri Radhika Prana Nata Pada Sarojayo Yena Premanubhutyasha Dattam Tam Shri Gurum Bhaje Shri Govinda Pararavinda Marupananya Bilashojitan Purna Prema Rasotsavo Jalamano Vritti Prasannananan Shashvad Krishna Katha Mahamrita Payora Shomura Kelato Vande Bhagavata Niman Anudavam Murdnani Patyakshito Namah Shri Guru Krishnaya Nirupadi Kripa Krite Ya Shri Chaitanya Rupo Bhut Tanvan Prema Rasam Kalo Jayatam Surato Pangor Mama Mandamater Gati Mutsarvasva Parambojo Radha Madana Mohano Adadana Dantair Yacheham Puna Puna Srimad Rupa Parambojo Dhyuli Syam Janma Janmani Abhirapali Patiputra Kanta Dasya Bilashati Balashvavara Sri Rupa Chintamala Sapti Sangsto Matsvanta Durdanta Haiturastam Raganugami Bhajano Lasamanasanam Shri Radhaya Sahasada Smaratam Brajendhum Shri Rupa Pada Kamala Shrita Cheta Samme Chittam Satam Marukari Yatu Pada Padme Bhaktir Yanikilarta Varga Jananiya Brahma Sakshat Krite Anandatishaya Prada Vishayajat Sukyat Vimukti Yaya Shri Radha Ramanam Param Bhajayugam Yasya Mahanashrayo Ya Karya Vrajaloka Gurutara Prem Naivatasya Namah Yaram Yanikila Ghashanga Shamani Shrutratritim Sangata Ya Swadhyay Rusukai Sukabdi Janani Dhikarya Mukti Spriham Shri Radha Yadhyata Hridaye Brajendra Tanuja Premamrita Syandini Saji Yadhari Bhakta Vrinda Mohita Dhanyeha Padyavali. By the grace of Shri Kali Yuga Pavana, the Svabhajana Vibhajana, Prayojana Avatar, Prema Purushottam, Karuna Mahasagar, Shri Gauranga Mahaprabhu, and his beloved Parshad, the crest jewel of Gaudiya Vaishnavacharyas, the fulfiller of his heart's desire on this earth, Sri Rupa Gosvami Pāda. Again, today we continue our discussion of Padyavali. And today, after quite a number of talks, maybe, 15 or so, we come to the last of our discussion of this section on Bhagavad-dharma-tattva that Rupa Goswami has offered based on this verse from a southerner where he censures various attitudes which are unfavorable to Bhagavad-dharma. So we've been unpacking this series of censures so as to arrive at what are the favorable attitudes that are conducive to performance of Bhagavad-dharma. So we're here in the last section, and this is governing how a Vaishnava will see devatas other than Bhagavan Vishnu. So we started this subject last time, and we looked at how Jiva Goswami has used these terms Anya Upasana or Ananya Upasana, that for bhakti to qualify as Uttama Bhakti, it must be Upasana that has no other object, and that this singularity of the object of the bhakti is itself considered a great virtue. And this was something taught by Bhagavan Sri Krishna in the Gita when he says, Apichet Suduracharo Bhajate Mam Ananya Bhak. And Jiva Gosvami commented that Ananya Bhak means that they are a worshipper of no other, meaning they're a worshipper of Bhagavan and not anyone else. So even if their conduct is terrible, just by the fact that they're a worshipper of Bhagavan alone makes them worthy of respect, or makes them fit to be regarded as sadhu. And then soon their conduct will come in alignment with their noble resolve. This is in gist 930, 931 in the Gita. So that was one of the evidences that Jiva Goswami gave for this principle of ananya upasana. And in what you could call the vyatirek, or the converse of that, was he censured what is called swatantra upasana, or worshipping any devata with the idea that that devata is independent of Bhagavan. So notably, what he doesn't censure is worship of other devatas that when they're not considered independent of Bhagavan. So that's what we'll look at today, because a superficial reading of the verse under discussion would be that we shouldn't worship anyone except Bhagavan. So worshipping any devata is bad except Bhagavan. So this is certainly not the advice of the Goswamis, or what we find throughout the rest of their teachings. So for those who follow the path of Uttama Bhakti, for those who worship the supreme, all-pervading, all-integrating entity, how should they also regard the other devatas that are found to exist throughout both the Mayik and Aprakrita realms? That's what we'll unpack today. So, I pick up from the top of the fresh file. A further question can still arise. So we left off with Jiva Goswami addressing the question of how it is that devatas can be considered worshipable other than Bhagavan, or how they can be considered one with Bhagavan. So he gave the explanation that they can be considered one with Bhagavan insofar as they are considered avatars of Bhagavan, or vibhutis of Bhagavan, or simply that they are very dear to Bhagavan. So, further elaborating in this regard, a further question can still arise, however, as to how a follower of the path of Uttama Bhakti should understand the various statements in the Shastra, such as the Vaishnava Agamas, that enjoin worship of the devatas. So, you can find statements that say no other devata should be worshipped except Bhagavan, but you can also find statements telling you to worship those other devatas. So how to reconcile these two categories of statements? Sri Sanatana Pad and Sri Rupa Pad cite the following verse from Padma Puran in regard to this subject. And I think this also comes in the Charitamrita. So he says, Vyamohaya characharasya jagatasya te te puranagamas tam tam meva hi devatam paramika jalpantu kalpavadhi siddhante punareka eva Bhagavān viṣṇu samastagama vyapareshu vivechana vyatikaram niteshu nischiyate. Let the various Puranas and Agamas chatter about the supposed supremacy of various devatas, for the sake of deluding the world of moving and stationary beings, to the end of the kalpa. Means, let them talk all they want for as long as they like. When, however, the expressions of all the agamas are brought into conjoint examination, then, in accord with their ultimate conclusion, or siddhanta, one alone, Bhagavan Viṣṇu, is ascertained to be supreme. So in other words, you can find so many apparently conflicting statements, you can find injunctions for this and that and so many things. But what he calls here conjoint examination, when you bring all of these different directives together, when you look at who is the intended audience of the directive, what is the underlying purpose of the directive, and you consider then a gradation, or what they call adhikari paid, or levels of eligibility for particular types of injunctions, then you can arrive at this ultimate conclusion that there is one supreme entity, namely Bhagavan Vishnu. So Sanatana Gosvami, he comments on this verse in the Hari Bhakti Vilas as follows. Quote, "Let the various Puranas and Agamas chatter" is an expression in mockery. Like the statement of Brahma near the end of his praises of Bhagavan Sri Krishna during the Brahma Vivohana Leela, quote, "Let those who think they certainly know you, know you." So, in other words, he's saying, if people want to think, oh, I know who is Krishna, okay, let them know him. Meaning, they don't know him at all, but if they want to think so, well, fine, let them think so. So, in other words, it's not that he's, by saying, let all these scriptures chatter about this and that, it's not that he's actually in favor of all that chattering, but it's a dismissive sense of permission. Then, the meaning of the second half of the verse is as follows. When the expressions, that is, aims of all the agamas, that is, shastras, such as the Skanda Puran, are brought into conjunction, that is, connection for examination, that is, deliberation, because of the adverse argumentation of some expressions therein, in accord with their ultimate conclusion on the subject, it is ascertained that one alone, Bhagavan Vishnu, is the supreme Ishvara. So by saying, when these expressions, that is, aims, in other words, when the purpose, not only the literal words, but the purpose of the words is conjointly analyzed, then one can see that there isn't actually a contradiction between these injunctions. So in other words, injunctions can apply to at different tiers to an overall set of teachings that guide people through, a hierarchy and practices. So there need not be considered anything inconsistent or problematic in what is found. Okay, so that's how Sanatana Gosvami comments on the verse. Now Jiva Gosvami, he also comments on this verse as follows. Let them, meaning the Puranas and Agamas, speak bit by bit to persons incapable of accurate deliberation on the great statements in the form of all the Puranas and Agamas, is the meaning, since, quote, in accord with their ultimate conclusion, one alone, Bhagavan Vishnu, is ascertained to be supreme. So here Jiva Gosvami is taking it that when this dismissive permission is given, the idea is that those type of statements that speak of the supremacy of these other devatas, those are for persons of lesser capability with regard to deliberation about the nature of absolute reality. So he's therefore implying that there's an application of what's called adhikari bhed, or injunctions for different persons of different levels of eligibility or capability. So the implied sense is that when these statements speak of these other devatas as supreme, that's for those of a lesser degree of deliberation. So, quote, expressions refers to the functions of the conventional and so on, meaning the conventional meaning of words, the etymological meaning of words, and so forth. So in other words, he's saying when you deliberate on these things, you have to be able to ascertain what is the etymological meaning of the words, what is the conventional, or in other words, the primary meaning based on conventional usage, and then determine when and where which meaning is applicable. In accord with the ultimate conclusion, which comes about when their expressions are brought into that conjoint examination, one alone, Bhagavan, is ascertained to be supreme. So Valadevidyabhushan, he also comments on this verse in his commentary on Rupa Goswami's citation of it in the Laghu Bhagavatamrita. So he adds the following. When, however, the expressions of all the agamas, that is, the denotations, indications, and so on thereof, are brought into conjunction for analysis, then, when the ultimate conclusion emerges from the Brahma Sutras and their commentary, Srimad Bhagavatam, Vishnu alone is ascertained to be, is ascertained to be the embodiment of unchecked consciousness and bliss, and to be possessed of supremacy. So he's he's getting hermeneutical mileage, if you will, out of this term expressions. So he's taking it that what the text is, quote, expressing has to do with both what it denotatively conveys, what it connotatively conveys, and to arrive at an ultimate understanding of the whole body of the scriptures, one has to attune oneself to which sense is applicable where. And by doing so, one can reconcile them all into a coherent view. So, for followers of the path of Uttama Bhakti, who understand that the Shastra's ultimate import is in this way, Sri Jiva Pod also explains multiple practical approaches they can take in regard to statements that enjoin worship of various devatas. So now we're applying this point. In other words, based on this statement in the Padma Puran, analyzed in this way, okay, Bhagavan Vishnu is supreme above all the other devatas, he's to be worshipped. But that doesn't erase the existence of these other devatas, or it doesn't exactly tell us how exactly we should act, unless we take a rash, overly simplistic stance and just say, we're not going to worship anyone except Vishnu. And this does not go over well in the cases where it's been applied. So how then, both in terms of to, so to speak, integrate oneself into the network of relationships that these devatas are a part of in a grand cosmic sense, and also we can say this has tangible significance in a cultural sense here on earth, in that especially people who live in the Indian subcontinent, there are very strong traditions that are part of people's family origins or part of people's local regions where the worship of certain devatas is considered customary. And so if someone were to rashly reject that, it would lead to argument, it would lead to misunderstanding. So how can someone foster this understanding and yet also conduct themselves within a social context that leads to what's called loka sangraha, or social cohesion, where their behavior can be a beneficial example to others without alienating them? In other words, in the Gita and elsewhere, Krishna says not to do what is called buddhiḥ, or try to convince people of something that they're not eligible yet to understand. And if persons who are accustomed to certain family traditions, worshipping certain devatas, and you come along and say, no, that's all bad, you should only worship this person, they're not going to understand, and then they're going to think negatively of that Vaishnava, when that Vaishnava actually may have a more sophisticated understanding, but because the persons who are seeing that may not be able to understand that, it's actually better for the Vaishnava to show respect to what they're doing presently and then give a gradual exposure to a way that they could refine their approach, because if they just rashly reject it, then it leads to them condemning the very source of what could lead them to something progressive. So, Jiva Gosvami elaborates on this in the Bhakti Sandarbha, especially in Anucheda 106. So what comes now is like a condensation of an elaborate discussion that he gives of this topic. So he offers a number of strategies, if you will. One is that they can worship the devatas who preside over the various aspects of the Mayic world as Vaishnavas. This means that the devatas are worshipable by virtue of their being Vaishnavas, and they are fit to receive worship as a Vaishnava receives worship. That is, they can be worshipped with the remnants of offerings made to Sri Bhagavān. So we see this in many cases in Braj and other regions where Vaishnavas may also have a temple of, say, Shivji, and they'll offer the Shiv Thakur the prasad of the Krishna Thakur or the Vishnu Thakur at their temple. Alternately, Sri Jiva Pod explains that devatas can be worshipped specifically by virtue of their being dwelling places or adhishtanas of all-pervading Sri Bhagavān. So as it's given there in the 11th canto, that if one sees even a blade of grass to be a dwelling place of Bhagavān and bows down to that blade of grass with the understanding that Bhagavān is present there, they can attain moksha just by doing that. So if someone can worship even a blade of grass, seeing it as a dwelling place of Bhagavān, then why can't they worship a greatly worshipable devata in the same way? What's hard to understand about that? So this is one strategy. Or just the presence of Sri Bhagavan can be worshipped within the devata on account of their being dwelling places of his. So in other words, Bhagavan is present in this devata or in this blade of grass. So you could worship literally the devata or the blade of grass with the understanding that Bhagavan is there. Or the second viewpoint is that Bhagavan is inside the blade of grass or inside the devata, and I'm worshipping the Bhagavan who's inside. So either way. And Sri Jiva Prabhupada recounts in this regard the history recorded in Vishnu Dharmottara Puran of a deity of Bhagavan Nrsimha named Linga Spota. A one-pointed Vaishnava Brahman named Vishwaksena was once forced to perform worship of a Shiva Linga by the son of a local village chieftain, who saw Sri Shiva as a devata independent of Sri Bhagavan and supreme solely in his own right. He also wanted to force this attitude on those in his jurisdiction. So this is in the era where there were feuds going on between the Shaivas and the Vaishnavas, and these statements were being written, better to be devoured by a tiger than enter a Shiva temple, and things like this were taking place where there was a significant amount of threat of violence between Shaivas and Vaishnavas, and both were arguing for the supremacy and independence of their devata. So there was a local chieftain, or you could say a brazen son of a local chieftain who wanted to assert the viewpoint of his family and force Vaishnavas to become Shaivas. So there was a devout Vaishnav Brahman, and so the local, prince or whatever you want to call him comes and tries to force the Brahman to become a Shaiva. So what did the Brahman do? Considering the Shiv Linga a dwelling place of his all-pervading Ishta Devata, Bhagavan Nrsimha, the Vaishnav Brahman made an offering to the indwelling presence of Nrsimha in the Shiva Linga. So the chieftain's son is there with a sword, ordering him to do puja. So when he does puja, when he says the mantra, he uses a mantra as an offering to Nrsimha. So the chieftain understands that the Brahman is worshipping Shiva, but he's actually still worshipping Vishnu. So the son of the local chieftain, who was trying to force him to worship Shiva specifically, became enraged that the Vaishnav Brahman did not make the offering specifically to Shiva, but rather to the presence of Bhagavan Nrsimha within the Shiva Linga. He raised a sword to kill the Vaishnava Brahman in retaliation. But when Bhagavan Nrsimha burst forth from the Shiva Linga, he saved his bhakta. Thereafter, the Shiva Linga came to be regarded as a deity of Bhagavan Nrsimha and to be known as, quote, Linga Spota, or he who burst forth from the Shiva Linga. So Jiva Goswami tells this story or refers to this story to illustrate an instance of this idea of worshipping the presence of Bhagavan in the devata. So devatas as Vaishnavas, devatas as dwelling places of Bhagavan, or Bhagavan in the devata. He's given these three options so far, but he gives more. Sri Jiva Prabhupada also explains that the devatas can be worshipped as vibhutis, that is, minor worldly manifestations of Sri Bhagavan's magnificence, and that Srimad Bhagavatam describes instances of this being done by Sri Prahlad Maharaj, as well as by eternal associates of Sri Bhagavan, such as the Pandavas. So I think devotees are well acquainted in the 10th chapter of the Gita. There's a section which is called Vibhuti Yoga, where Krishna explains his vibhutis, or his magnificences, and says, among Pandavas I am Arjuna, and among letters I am the first A, and among tastes I am water, and in other words, among all these different categories, I'm the most excellent instance of the category. So these are things that naturally evoke reverence or naturally evoke regard. When we see, the beauty of the sunset or the beauty of a tree or a leaf or any feature of nature is actually quite fascinating if you look at it closely enough or thoughtfully enough. So all this wonder in the world, this can all be seen as an indicator or a reminder of the greatness of Bhagavān, he from whom this whole world becomes manifest. And this is a major theme in the Gita, right? Aham sarvasya prabhavo mata sarvam pravartate iti matva. Just knowing that everything that you see comes from him is enough to enable you to worship him, bhava samanvita, filled with bhav. In other words, to worship him with some feeling for the value of doing so. In the most loose sense, obviously there's more to that statement than that, but so even persons who are so famous for being one-pointed devotees of Bhagavān, like Prahlad Maharaj and the Pandavas, even they also perform worship of Bhagavān's vibhutis. So Jiva Gosvami cites as an example the Rajasuya Yajna, that is, the coronation sacrifice performed by the Pandavas led by Yudhishthira Maharaj, which had the ultimate aim of propitiating Sri Bhagavān, but also included worship of the devatas as vibhutis for the sake of promoting social cohesion. So Yudhishthira is taking the role of the emperor. He wants to look after all of his subjects, and he knows that many of these traditions are well established in regions of his kingdom, so he's not trying to unsettle that, but he's conducting a coronation that's in accord and will be understood by people who are accustomed with these different things. Sri Yudhishthira appealed to Bhagavān to enable them to connect this sacrifice as follows. So this is stated in the Bhagavatam 10.72.3. O Govinda, I desire to worship your purifying vibhutis by means of the king of sacrifices, the Rajasuya. O Master, please cause this to be accomplished. So, Yudhishthira Maharaj, famous for being a one-pointed bhakta of Krishna, is even praying to Krishna to help them perform this worship of his vibhutis. Okay, following Sri Sanatana Pad's comments on this verse, Sri Jiva comments that because Yudhishthira Maharaj went on to worship the devas and others in this sacrifice, with the understanding of their being Sri Bhagavān's vibhutis, his being one-pointedly devoted to Sri Bhagavān is illustrated. And he describes Sri Bhagavān's vibhutis as being, quote, purifying because they dispel defects, that is, defects that are obstructions to bhakti to Sri Bhagavān. So, from this commentary, we can understand that there's no lack or no detriment to one's akantita or one's one-pointedness upon Bhagavān, even in the act of worshipping these vibhutis or avatars or other manifestations of Bhagavān. So what really makes one aikantik is not even literally the visible object of one's worship, but the attitude and the intent within one's worship. So as we've discussed many times in the Hari Bhakti Vilas, when Sanatana Gosvami gives a gradation in the characteristics that establish the nature of a Vaishnava, he makes akantita, or one-pointedness, the foremost characteristic. In other words, what really makes a Vaishnava, that they're one-pointed upon Vishnu. So that essential characteristic of being a Vaishnava is not in any way lacking in this respect, because someone might say, okay, if you want to honor the presence of Bhagavān here and there, well, that's fine, but I just worship my deity. I'm not worshipping anyone else. I'm one-pointed. So, not quite. In other words, to think that simply superficial singularity is the essence of one-pointedness or is a superior grade of one-pointedness, that will be a shallow understanding. So, Jiva Goswami's point here, that rather Yudhishthira Maharaj's worship of these vibhutis is an illustration of Yudhishthira's one-pointedness, not something that points out that it's lesser, and that even that worship of those vibhutis can be purifying, or it can also be, it can also lead to one overcoming obstructions on the path of bhakti. So, a little more in this regard. Another consideration Sri Jivapad addresses in this regard is that of aprakrita devatas, that is, the devatas who are eternal servants of Sri Bhagavān situated in Vaikuntha, and who preside in service to Sri Bhagavān over various aspects of the realms within that spiritual domain. So, for example, in Braj, we know that the Brajbasis, they worship Shiv Thakur, they worship Surya. Radharani's family are all traditionally worshippers of Surya. Going off to do Surya Puja is a very good excuse for Radharani and her friends to get out of the house. So the presence of devatas is fully integrated even into the aprakrita lila of Radha and Krishna, as well as that of Sita and Ram, as well as that of Lakshmi and Narayan. So discussion of the worship of devatas wouldn't be complete if we didn't also address how these aprakrita devatas are to be seen. So these devatas have the same names as the devatas within the Mayic world, yet are different from them, since these devatas are constituted of Sri Bhagavan's Sarup Shakti, meaning the devatas that exist in the material world, their bodies are not manifestations of Sarup Shakti, their bodies are also temporary, are subject to creation and dissolution and so forth, and are fundamentally Mayic, whereas these aprakrita devatas in the eternal realm, they're also of eternal nature. So they're of Sarup Shakti, not the Mayic Shakti. Worship of these devatas as one of the surrounding retinues of Sri Bhagavan at his Yogapīt is described in the Vaishnava Agamas, in Srimad Bhagavatam, in the process of worship taught by Bhagavan Sri Krishna, and in the process of worship outlined in Hari Bhakti Vilas. So when Hari Bhakti Vilas describes the elaborate puja process, when it comes to what's called Avaran Puja, it mentions among the circles of, entourages of Bhagavan, also entourages of the devatas who are worshipped. And in what's referred to here is in the 11th canto, I think it's chapter 27, when Krishna is teaching the process of archana to Uddhava, and he's teaching the worship of himself, he also mentions worshipping around him these aprakrita devatas in the Yogapīt. So these things are in the very central, Gaudiya Vaishnava texts. Sri Jivapad cites in this regard a passage from Padma Puran that sums up the majority of the points he makes regarding the various devatas throughout his Bhagavat Sandarbha, and speaks specifically to the topic of worship of the aprakrita devatas. So this is quoted in, I don't have the number here. I believe it's the Bhakti Sandarbha. He says, Tasmad avaidikanam cha devanam archanam tyajet, swatantra pujanam yatra vaidikanam api tyajet, archayitva jagadbandyam devam narayanam harim, tadavarana sangstanam devasya paritor chayet, harer bhukta vasheshena balim tebhyo vinikshipet, homan chaiva prakurvita naiva vaiṣṇavah. Therefore, furthermore, one should reject worship of non-Vedic devas, and one should reject independent worship even of the Vedic devas. After worshipping the deva honorable to the entire world, that is, the deva worthy of the worship even of all other devas, namely Narayan, Hari, one should worship the multitude of retinues around the deva. A Vaishnava should present them, that is, these aprakrita devatas in Vaikuntha at the Yogapīt, an offering with Hari's remnants, and make an oblation for them only with his remnants. So this, in essence, condenses much of what Jiva Gosvami explained at length into one passage. Perhaps it's one of his sources for much of the analysis that he gave. So he's saying, don't worship devatas thinking they're independent of Bhagavān, and don't worship devatas that are not mentioned in the Shastras that describe Bhagavān, but worship them as in the retinue or among the entourage of Bhagavān, just as Bhagavān is worshipable, so also his dham, his companions, etc. are also worthy of worship, but worship them with remnants of what has been offered to Bhagavān. Sri Jiva also addresses in this regard the statements that can be found in the Shastra that describe worshippers of various devatas attaining the same ultimate end that bhaktas of Sri Bhagavan do, such as the following. So we discussed earlier statements in the Gita where Krishna says, if you worship the devas, you go to the devas. If you worship the spirits, you go to the spirits. If you worship me, you come to me. So who you worship, you go to the object of your worship. You don't all go to the same place. So that some may say, okay, great, clear, makes sense. But there are also statements that seem to say almost the exact opposite, such as the following. This Jiva Goswami cites from the Padma Puran. And this is said to be spoken by none other than Krishna himself, where he says, Shaivas, that is worshippers of Shiva, Sauras, worshippers of Surya, Ganeshas, worshippers of Ganesh, Vaishnavas, worshippers of Vishnu, and Shaktas, worshippers of Shakti, attain me alone here in this world, just as rainwater attains the ocean. So Krishna is saying, you're a Shaiva, you're a Shakta, you're a Ganesha, no problem, you all come to me. Over there he said, if you worship Devas, you go to Devas, if you worship me, you come to me. Now he says, you worship Surya, you worship Shiva, you all come to me. I am one, yet manifest verily in 5 ways, on account of my various names and play. Just as Devadatta is someone in accord with the names for a person of sun and so on. So the name Devadatta is kind of like the equivalent in, at least in the US, what you see, the name John Doe, where you have a blank check or a blank credit card and it'll have the name John Doe on it. There's no actual person named John Doe, it just means anybody. So usually in Nyaya and a lot of Sanskrit texts, for whatever reason, the name Devadatta is equivalent to that. So he's saying that I am one, yet manifest in 5 ways, on account of my names and play. In other words, I'm one, and I express myself in various ways. I'm known by various names, just as Devadatta is known by various names like a son and so on. Meaning, just as one man is known by different names, such as son or father or brother and so on, based on the different relationships he has with his father, son, brother, and so forth. So this verse would appear to say that Ganesh, Shiva, Surya, they're all just different expressions of me, and whichever name you call that expression, whichever name you consider, that's all fine and the same. So, how to understand this? Sri Jiva explains that statements such as this do not actually refer to the attainment of Bhagavan specifically by worship of Shiva or Surya or other devas. Rather, they refer to pure bhakti to Bhagavan performed in the form of japa or other forms of worship of these devas that is done specifically with the aim of pleasing Sri Bhagavan. So this is the caveat that Jiva Goswami brings. In other words, he says, if someone does worship Ganesh or Surya or whoever, then that could result in them pleasing Bhagavan and attaining Bhagavan, if fundamentally their intention and their attitude in performing that worship is that they're doing that worship to please Bhagavan. So the implication is that if that's not their intention, in other words, if their fundamental conscious orientation is not fixed on Bhagavan, then they won't come to Bhagavan. But if that fundamental conscious orientation is set upon Bhagavan, then whatever they're worshipping can lead to their attainment of Bhagavan. So someone might say, wow, that's pretty liberal. So let's look at what Vishwanath Chakravarti says in this regard. Sri Vishwanath Chakravarti discusses this distinction in his commentary on verse 924 of Sri Gita, which was cited earlier in regard to this subject. So verse 924, he comments as follows, saying, I alone am the enjoyer and the master, that is, bestower of the results of all that worship they perform for other devatas. So when Krishna says, Bhoktacha Prabhurevacha, that I'm the one who enjoys what they offer, I'm the one who gives the results of what they worship, that when he says that, he means that they're worshipping other devatas, but that is ultimately actually coming to me through that other devata, and I'm actually giving them the result of their worship through that other devata. They, however, do not properly understand me in truth, and thus fall down. That is, they remain in samsara. It means they're thinking, no, this devata is actually who is supplying and fulfilling my desires. They're not aware that it's actually Bhagavān and that this devata is just functioning as an intermediary. So Chakravarti Pad illuminates this whole point as follows. He says, quote, as if Bhagavān is speaking of those worshippers of other devatas, saying, they, however, do not properly understand me in truth. For example, they have this mentality, quote, I am a worshipper of Surya. May Surya specifically be gracious towards me. Means they're not thinking, I'm worshipping Bhagavān in Surya. They're thinking, no, I'm worshipping Surya. I want the grace of Surya. May Surya specifically bestow my desired result. Please, Surya, give me this. Surya specifically is the supreme Ishvara, and it is not that the supreme Ishvara Narayan specifically is Surya. So this is the distinction. Someone might worship Surya thinking, I'm worshipping Surya because Surya is a manifestation of Narayan. The other one is thinking, I'm worshipping Surya, and I think Surya is supreme, Narayan doesn't have anything to do with it. So he's trying to show the contrast in the mentality, and that the mentality is what's really important, not so much whether you worship Surya or not. So he says, he specifically, Surya, is the cause of such conviction, my shraddha that I have in Surya. Means Bhagavān in the Gita said that those people who have shraddha in other devatas, I'm the one allowing them to have that shraddha. I'm giving them that conviction in the other devata. But that person is thinking, no, this doesn't come from Krishna. This shraddha comes from Surya. It's the grace of Surya on me that I have shraddha in him. He specifically is the bestower of the result of my worship upon me. So this is that mentality. So he's saying, fixed in this mentality, they fall down because of their lack of proper understanding of me. That is, of I, Bhagavān, as the non-dual supreme entity, all-integrating of all devatas, such as Surya. So in other words, when their notion of the supreme is fixed on an entity within the realm of samsara, then they remain in samsara. When their notion of the supreme is an entity that transcends samsara, they ultimately attain a transcendental end. So as we've discussed many times, here also fits in the thread of what is called tat-kratu nyaya, or that one ultimately attains or becomes whatever it is that one idealizes and resolves to attain. So worshippers of me, facing all directions with the meditation, Bhagavān Narayan specifically is worshipable in the form of Surya and so on. That is, in the form of whatever I see around me within the visible world, however, are certainly liberated from samsara. So someone might worship Shiva or Surya, but if they think Shiva or Surya are independent of Bhagavān, then they remain in samsara. But someone else might see that Bhagavān is present in Surya, or even in a blade of grass, and by worshipping that, transcend samsara. So the external object of worship may be great, might even be small, but if there's a conscious orientation towards that ultimate reality within their performance of worship, then they'll attain that ultimate object. Therefore, worship of my vibhutis, such as Surya, is to be performed only upon being preceded by awareness of Surya and so forth being my vibhutis, and not rather otherwise. So what is Krishna teaching in the Gita here? He's not ultimately saying don't worship any other devata. He's just saying worship everything as a manifestation of me. He says this at the end of the 9th chapter, And then what does he do in the 10th chapter? He goes in even more elaborately and lists all these different vibhutis and says, I'm the, greatest, bird in the sky, I'm the greatest, aquatic in the ocean, and all of this. In other words, anything that you feel reverence for, anything that you see as great, if you worship that as an aspect of myself, or you worship me through that, that also will do. So, let's conclude the topic. In summary, when one has the intention to worship Sri Bhagavan specifically, by means of worship of a particular devata, who is understood to be dependent upon him, one's worship is pleasing to Bhagavan and can bear the fruit of liberation from samsara. But when one has the intention to worship a particular devata with the idea that the devata is separate from and independent of Sri Bhagavan, that is, when one engages in this, which Sri Jiva dubs, quote, worship of another, or independent worship, what he calls anya upasana or swatantra upasana, one's worship does not bear the fruit of liberation. Sri Jiva also summarizes his extended discussion of worship of various devatas in Bhakti Sandarbha 106 by saying that it is this independent worship of devatas specifically that is condemned, and that worship of devatas is rather a quality when it is performed with the understanding of them, quote, belonging to him, or being tadiya. Be that in the sense of them being a vaiṣṇava, meaning a servant of his in the Mayic world, being to a dwelling place of his, 3, being his vibhuti, or 4, being part of his entourage at the Yog Pit as one of his eternal servants in Vaikuntha. Thus, now applying all of this analysis to the verse under discussion, the censure in the verse under discussion of, quote, the notion of equality with those other than himself in relation to Viṣṇu is stated for the purpose of teaching that a follower of the path of Uttama Bhakti sees all the various devas as non-separate dependents upon Bhagavan, who are worthy of honor by virtue of their belonging to him and being dwelling places of him. So that concludes this analysis of verse 114. So we looked at how to conceive of Vaishnavas and how to conceive of their caste and all of the aspects of relative respectability between those two things. We looked at the guru and how the guru is to be respected, and also at the deity and how the deity is to be honored as a place of Bhagavan. And then the other topics in the verse, the name of Bhagavan, the remnants of Bhagavan, and now finally other devatas in relation to Bhagavan. So all of these attitudes are essential to following the path of Bhagavad-dharma. There's a right way and a wrong way, or how we understand these things and how we refine our attitudes in this regard enriches and ultimately determines the outcome of whatever practices of bhakti we engage in. So for this reason, Rupa Goswami cites the verse, and we've tried from the works of Sanatana Gosvami, Jiva Gosvami, and others to draw out all the relevant discussion. So I'll conclude here for today. There's, I think, only one more verse, in this Bhagavad-dharma-tattva, this particular prakaran. There's just one more verse in the section, so we'll look at that next time. And then we'll be on to the next portion of the Padyavali. So if anyone has any comments, questions, corrections, or feedback of any other type, please feel free to share.
Hello?
Yes? Jai Radhe.
Can you hear me? Okay, good. Yeah, oh yeah. So my microphone goes down. Something goes down, so I turn on the mic. Can you hear me better now? Or?
I hear you just fine.
Yeah, you're not so strong. Anyway, so regarding this Devata Upasana versus Bhagavan Upasana, there's a notion that you shouldn't disturb Radha Krishna Lila if we are in need of help. So better is to worship Nishingadev to protect our existence or particular calamity we're going through or anything, or even worshiping specific deities, demigods. Not worshiping in the sense of just to worship, but throwing our request to ease the karmic reactions of in our life, not because of the disrespect of Bhagavan or because he's not able to or capable to, but because he's out of respect of his lila, not to disturb him. And in a way, those devatas are propitiated for very specific reasons. They are responsible for every aspect of our life and body or anything, karmically speaking. So it's logically speaking, it would be better to address devatas to ease our karmic suffering, which is, like, for example, unbearable, or than to bother Bhagavan with our own, tiny problems that for him is nothing, for us is something big. I was wondering if is transgressing the Anyabhilashita Shunyam verse, definition of what's bhakti actually.
And
or not.
This idea that you're presenting, are you quoting any text, or is this?
No, I'm just referring to. No text. I'm just referring to. I think in other societies, some teachers establish Nishingadev Upasana for Radha Krishna Bhaktas in that context, that not to disturb Bhagavan Lila and asking for any mundane help from Nishingadev.
Okay.
I think Bhaktivinoda Thakur recommended.
I mean, in the Sharanagati Prakaran that we discussed in regard to the Charitamrita recently, it's not coming to my mind exactly which verse it was on, but on either that verse of Akrura or that verse of Uddhava, I'll have to double check, it was in the text. There's, when Vishwanath Chakravarti Pada is commenting on that subject, then when he's speaking about accepting Bhagavan as one's guardian, he says one should harbor no hesitation to appeal to Bhagavan for his help. In other words, that this is some burden upon Bhagavan. Don't think like that. Bhagavan is inconceivably all capable. So he discouraged that idea that seeking support from Bhagavan would be something detrimental to his lila. And Sanatana Gosvami also made the point that karpanya, or this saying Bhagavan raksha rakshaivam, as Sridhar Swami rendered it, that to call out to Bhagavan for protection, that this is also a way of expressing affection to Bhagavan. In other words, when one is in need, who you turn to when you're really in need, that shows who you really trust and who you really care about and who you're really willing to expose your vulnerability to. So when Bhagavan's bhaktas turn to him in need, that's not like, hey, why are you bothering me with your problem? Like, hey, I'm a big shot. Why are you making me do this little job? From that perspective that those commentators give there, Bhagavan rather finds that endearing, that these people, they come to me, they trust me, they rely on me, they bring what's really, really relevant and needed in their life to me. That is a testament to the solidity of the relationship. So in that respect, or if you look at it from that angle of vision, this idea that you're going to like interrupt the Leela, it's like, come on, man, you're going to interrupt Radha Krishna Leela? Like, that's already been inconceivably managed since eternity. They're lost in, that Ross, whether you're praying over here for X, Y, or Z or not.
Yes, I understand that.
So,
okay, but yes.
Lastly, I'll just say that, but as far as, petitioning the Lord with prayer, as one American rock star put it. When and where that's necessary, also the criterion will be, as you brought up in reference to the definition of Uttama Bhakti, that one's only desire, one's only aim is bhakti. This is what it means to be anyabhilashita shunya. So, if one's prayers are specifically related to overcoming obstacles to that one-pointedness upon Bhagavan, or for the sake of satisfying and serving Bhagavan, then those are in the groove, so to speak. And broadly speaking, as came up earlier in the Charitamrita, moksha kamo daradi, whether you want moksha or whether you want this or that or anything, just worship Bhagavan. This is also told in the Bhagavad to help everybody gradually integrate some form of Bhagavat upasana. But as far as the path of Uttama Bhakti, then the criterion will become that any seeking of protection or what have you will be all, attuned to the idea of trying to follow the path of Uttama Bhakti, free from that which is contrary to that.
Yeah, this is kind of tricky, because in one way you are going to rely on grace and of Bhagavan, whatever he desires, but someone's position may be quite difficult and to bear, material position, and that time, there may be notion or just tendency to think, oh, Bhagavan, he may give or he may not give what I'm asking for, depending on how he sees me progressing, on a path to him. But Devata is literally are obliged by certain specific prayers or mantras.
You're sounding very clever here, my friend.
Yeah. I'm just sharing the psychology behind this kind of thinking.
Okay.
That if I'm really in desperate situation, I know Bhagavan, he does whatever he wants. Krishna is tricky, and he says, we know the nature of Krishna is quite tricky. And same time,
So you don't want to get involved in that kind of trickster, do you? You'd rather deal with somebody who's legally bound to give you what you want.
Well, if your condition suppresses the enthusiasm for bhakti, or cripples your ability to actually do seva, somebody's in pain, for example, how can he peacefully study or peacefully chant or focus if that condition is so difficult? That he would rather, remove this first in order to actually feel relief and continue on the path of bhakti, as opposed to suffer so much, and concentration all the focus goes on the pain, as opposed to as a devotion. Which, you can debate, because the pain may cause the devotion in the heart of Vaishnavas, true. But if the situation persists and somebody finds, despite of asking Bhagavan, please help, and he finds like, oh my God, and nothing's happening, and I'm still in a deprecated position, then he would really, with permission of Bhagavan, would ask some devatas. Just like
So you said with permission.
Yes.
How would that work? How is it that you would ask Bhagavan would not give, and then you ask permission to go ask someone else? How would all that unfold?
Well, if Bhagavan feels like helping, then with his permission, I want to. I know. It's convoluted a bit, but it's just not. It's a subtle difference between understanding what Sharanagati is really. It's just bearing anything, or just, or accepting your situation, I'm just a bit not clear about it, but the tendency is that, I think I just closed my mind already enough to be judged. But I think, there might be this hesitation that, Bhagavan, he may consider or may not consider. And was good for me and good for Bhakta. What's the best solution? You may ask for a particular thing that you think that's an obstacle in your life, but he may or may not remove. You may feel, well, let's just let test you a little bit longer, see what happens. And
what about Rakshishiti Vishvaso? What about the conviction that Bhagavan will protect me as one of the limbs of Sharanagati?
Yes. Yeah, this may do. But if there is hesitation, would that be indicating, of course, to indicate somebody's really weak point of faith, I would say.
Could be. I mean, not that it's easy to have such faith, especially when one is in an acute situation, but as we talked about, bhajate mam ananya bhak, Bhagavan considers those who are one-pointed in their upasana, that itself is a great virtue. And especially in an acute situation, when one doesn't look to anyone except him, that is a profound expression of one-pointedness upon him and trust in him, and is, greatly endearing and solidifying of one's relationship with him. And I mean, sometimes it's easy to say, oh yeah, we get along with so-and-so or whatever, and then when it becomes difficult, then, we're just fair weather friends, so to speak. I worship Bhagavan, but when he doesn't give me what I want, then I go off to this devata or that devata. It's like, well, hey man, if you really surrender to him, if you really have confidence in his protection.
Yeah, but if you understand, I'm sorry. But if the devatas actually are extensions of Bhagavan, and they always act on their power comes from Bhagavan, they're empowered by Bhagavan.
Right. And if Bhagavan doesn't want to give you what you want, then why would they, if they're also under Bhagavan's control?
I see.
I mean, I'm not saying there's only one way to see this, but personally, I don't try to outsmart Bhagavan to get what I want, but that sense of trust in his protection, howsoever it comes, and an acceptance of his will is, in general, something that provides deep solace at the time of suffering in life.
No, but my tendency is to clear all the obstacles, and now I'm free to worship Bhagavan. This kind of mentality, right? Would it be also like tendency for moksha, just to ease the pain and move on the path, right? Because
I mean, some may seek that, but why seek it from anyone except Bhagavan?
Moksha udarati, right? Okay, thank you.
Anyway, I mean, I'm just sharing thoughts in a free-spirited manner. I'm not saying there's only one way to look at these things.
Oh, I see. What would Baba say, you think?
I can't think of anything other than what I've already said.
Yes. Okay. Obviously. Thank you.
All right, well, if that's it, we can conclude for today. So in our next session, we'll dive further into the next verse of Padyavali. So until then, vaiṣṇavebhyo namo namah. Jai Shri Guru, Jai Shri Gaur, Jai Radhe Shyam.